Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have a hand where I get aces. It's always nice whenever you get aces. So I do open it up under the gun. We are playing 150, 300, and I make it 800 out of my very deep stack. I think 900 is fine. I typically don't make small raises whenever we are playing somewhat deep stacked, and our 200 big blind or our opponent's 100 big blind stack certainly counts as deep stacked. So I make it 800, folds around to the small blind, who elects to make it 3,200. So some people may look at this and say, why did he make it so big? He made it 4 times your initial raise. But when deep stacked, you should be making it larger, especially from out of position, because you don't really mind if your opponent folds, assuming your range is not just entirely nut hands. And also, if your range is normally pretty small, like this opponent's likely range is just very, very strong hands, you don't really mind building the pot. That said, if you have your opponent completely crushed, like if you know you're only 3-betting aces, then you can make it small because your opponent's in bad shape no matter what. But again, because we're deep stacked, I definitely like the somewhat large 3-bet from him with a somewhat snug range. And now it's back to me. I have to decide if I want to call or 4-bet. So when you raise under the gun and someone else 3-bets you, especially the small blind, that is usually an extreme sign of strength. So for that reason, I think I want to go ahead and 4-bet. My opponent's range is very likely just really, really, really good hands. And if his range is really, really, really good hands, I want to go ahead and 4-bet and get money in the pot before the board comes in a manner that makes it to where my opponent will not pay me. Like imagine he has queens and it comes ace, king, 3, right? Then he's just never going to pay. Or if he has ace, king and it comes queen, 6, 2, he's never going to pay. So I want to go ahead and get more money in the pot. Obviously, this does make my range look strong, but I would like to have some bluffs here. Like if I had ace-5 suited opening under the gun, or maybe even a hand like ace-queen offsuit or ace-jack offsuit, maybe I'll bluff sometimes. When I do re-raise, I wish I would have made it a little bit bigger. Remember, he made it 3,200. I made it 6,800, so 3,600 on top, not much at all. But in general, it's fine to use small sizes when you're in position because you don't really care if your opponent sticks around because you're going to be in position as the aggressor with a strong range, right? So with my exact hand, this is fine, but I think I would have preferred to make it a little bit bigger just so I could add a few more bluffs into my range. But I do go with the sizing, and the opponent calls. So at this point, I do think he has just mostly good hands. I'm not really thinking he has too much stuff like pocket 8s or ace-jack offsuit. I think he has mainly just something like 10s or better and ace-king, although you will sometimes be surprised. As you're playing in smaller stakes events, usually players are going to show up with a little bit, slightly weirder hands that you would not necessarily expect. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The opponent checks, and I'm definitely going to continuation bet. Like I just said, this board should completely miss my opponent in every possible way. I mean, maybe he has 9s some portion of the time. Maybe he has something like ace-5 of diamonds, but that's okay. He also is going to have kings, queens, jacks, 10s, and maybe he sticks around with ace-king sometimes. So I'm going to make a small continuation bet, almost certainly. Pot's 14,000, I go 5,500. We don't need to go big here because most likely I have a pretty nice range advantage here unless my opponent's 3-betting range pre-flop is just really, really, really strong. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. If that's the case, we both have pretty much the same range. But from in position, I don't mind making a small bet. And if he folds, that's fine. Not when I have aces, but with the rest of my range. And if he calls, that's fine too, especially when I have a hand like aces. If my opponent check raised all in or something like that, I definitely would not fold. Turns a king. Opponent checks, and I elect to bet 5,500 again. The replayer got a little bit ahead of me, but I bet 5,500 again. This is a spot where if you rewind just a second, you would see the pot was about 24,000 or 25,000, and the opponent had about 22,000 left in his stack. Now I could go all in, but if I go all in for about the size of the pot, my opponent's probably going to call off only with ace-king and better. And obviously, I'm beating ace-king, but there aren't nearly as many ace-king combinations as normal. There are 2 aces remaining and 3 kings, so there's only 6 ace-king combinations remaining. There's clearly the 3 pocket kings combinations. There's the pocket aces that chop. So I'm getting money in ahead there, and that's fine. But you also want to ask, is there an alternative? If I instead bet 5,500, now will my opponent decide to call with just total garbage, like ace-queen or pocket 10s? If we can get him to call with those hands, then I think betting small is great, because now we're just getting 5,500 in or maybe 7,000 or something like that in against hands that are drawing very thin. So I'm definitely a fan of betting again and not going all in, because if you go all in, most players are not going to hero call with pocket queens or worse, and that should be a lot of his range at this point. So I like betting small. We don't want to check, though, because we want to be able to get money in the pot. Now, if you thought your opponent was going to really overvalue a hand like pocket tens if the turn checks through, like he's just always going to call off a river shove, then sure, go ahead and shove. But, I'm sorry, go ahead and check behind to induce your opponent to either shove or call off. But most of the time, people are competent, and they're not going to make that blunder. If river's a jack, opponent checks. So now, opponent has about half pot remaining. He has 17,000, pot's 36,000. I think I either need to go all in or check. If I go all in, it is obviously purely for value. The question is, though, what is he going to call with? Well, if he has queens or tens now, he's almost certainly going to fold. So he's going to call with probably ace-king or better. So like I said, 6 combinations of ace-king. There are 3 combinations of kings, 3 combinations of jacks, and 3 combinations of nines. So there are actually 9 combinations of sets I lose to, and 6 combinations of ace-king that I beat. So if we were just going straight up on that math, then I should definitely check. Notice he could also have a flush sporadically. Maybe he does have that ace-5 of diamonds. Given I bet small on the flop and bet small on the turn, he would certainly stick around with that. Or ace-queen of diamonds or ace-king of diamonds. So now we're up to maybe 12 or 13 combinations of hands that I lose to, and only 6 that I beat. That said, he may decide to call off with something like king-queen in this scenario, although he's probably not 3-betting that in the first place. And if he is, he's not going to call the 4-bet. And if he does call the 4-bet, he's not going to call the flop bet. So as you see, it's pretty hard for him to actually have many hands that I beat in this scenario that will also call if I value bet. So I think this is a pretty easy check behind. Even if the river was not a diamond, I would check behind. Say it was the jack of clubs instead. Because, like I said, I don't think many people are going to call a river shove with queens or tens at this point. So what's going to call me, right? Only ace-king and better. And against that range, I'm slightly behind. So I think we just need to check, even though we have the aces. And we lose to pocket jacks. That's pretty unfortunate. Sometimes your opponents are going to outdraw you. Some people may look at this and say, oh, well, clearly I should have just gone all in on the flop or made some gigantic bet on the flop. But that probably is not such a good strategy because you want to get paid by ace-king and ace-queen. And then on the turn, some people may say, oh, you should have shoved to make him fold his jacks. But the jacks had 5% equity. And when your opponents have 5% equity and they're still willing to call a bet, which, remember, he did put money in on the turn, that's usually a great result. Sometimes you can get outdrawn, but notice here, I got outdrawn, and I didn't even pay my opponent off, right? We just went check, check. So this hand worked out about as well as it possibly could, besides the fact that I got outdrawn on the river. If my opponent jammed into me on the river, that would have been a really rough spot, and I think I'm probably supposed to fold, because a lot of people are going to check ace-king there. So if they're checking ace-king, what does their jamming range look like? It's going to be flushes, sets, and then maybe some bluffs like queens and tens. But are people really bluffing queens and tens in that spot? I mean, probably not. So if my opponent does jam, I think I probably need to make a snug fold, but clearly you don't let your opponent know you're folding aces. Also realize I could certainly have kings in this spot, which is going to call every time. But if I am folding aces, I'm certainly folding way too often, because like what other better hands can I have, right? So if I'm folding my kings, I'm making an exploitative fold, but this is a spot where I think it's probably right if the opponent jams into me. All right, so that's going to be it for this hand. Thank you very much for being here at PokerNews.com. If you enjoy this, let them know on Twitter at PokerNews. And be sure to check back next week for another fun poker hand.